Okay. Hello and welcome to Sexy Sexy. And in today's episode, we have Sheila, my dear friend, and we want to talk about a very new but also very important topic, ecstatic birth. First of all, Sheila, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here and being willing to have this conversation about pleasure and birth.
Oh, yes. Where I'm from, giving birth is something associated with a lot of pain and suffering, and I've never been pregnant, and I just have friends around me and my family that gave birth, and they're all not looking forward to the day of giving birth. So that's why I want to take the time today with you and talk a little bit about this topic. And maybe we want to start about, tell me who you are and how did you get into this beautiful concept?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say that you're so not alone. That's really our cultural legacy and our religious inheritance, right? That women are supposed to suffer in childbirth. There's so many messages that reinforce that, including the experiences of people around us. So just wanted to normalize that. That's if you feel like childbirth is painful, if that's what you associate with childbirth, that's totally right in the mainstream. That's normal. So what we're doing here is pretty radical. For me, this work began with my own journeys, giving birth to my children. When I was pregnant the first time, it was amazing to me that my body knew just what to do, right? My body knew how to create life, gestate life. It was evolving, it was nurturing this growing being inside of me. And I've always been pretty fascinated about the natural world, but I didn't have any models in front of me, anyone in my family that had given birth naturally or anything like that. But I really wanted that for myself. I really wanted to have this experience where I could feel the power, like this primal power of my feminine body, my female body. And I didn't know how to create that. I didn't understand, some of the things that we're going to be talking about today that really prevent a woman from having a great experience. And that birth experience for me was pretty traumatic. And it was so traumatic that I actually had trouble conceiving my second child. I had a series of miscarriages. I had one pregnancy that I had to terminate. And I realized that something was off for me. And all the doctors I went to said, well, nothing's wrong with you. You just had bad luck. But I knew something was off. And for me, it was I had to heal the rift between me and my body that was created in my first birth. And so I went through a huge journey with that, which is, like a whole other big story. But in a nutshell, my second birth was a reclamation. I prepared with my whole heart, body, mind, and soul. I didn't, I honored my desire. I supported my desire. And I had this really incredible experience where I reclaimed my relationship with my body. And in all of my education and preparing for this birth, this was that girl, she's 13 years old now. So this is 13 years ago. And all the books I read and, all the teachers I followed, everything, there'd be one line in a 300-page book, let's say, or, one sentence in an hour-long class about, some women experience heightened states of bliss, ecstasy, even orgasm when they're giving birth. And in this second birth of mine, I understood for the first time what that was about. As I was pushing her out, all of my attention was with the sensations in my body. I was so deeply connected to my body. And it was fascinating to me. I could feel my whole body begin to expand and contract, almost like the wave of an orgasm. And I thought to myself, oh my God, it's true. It's true what they say. And then in that moment, I came back into my head and the moment was lost. But I remembered that. I remembered that moment. And when I was giving birth to my third child, I said, okay, well, I know I can do it. I know my body is capable of having this beautiful, connected, primal experience, but I want to know if I can enjoy it. Not just afterwards when it's yeah, I did it, I had the baby, but I wanted to know if I could enjoy the process of labor, the intensity of labor, the whole journey of it. And so that's really how I prepared for my third birth. And that experience, it really blew me away, because even though I was preparing for pleasure, it was so different from how I imagined it. And it really, it wasn't actually a very sexual experience. What happened in my third birth, my body guided me to start moving. It was a very pokey labor. And I danced through that birth. I danced through the labor. And it felt like those contractions were this like dance partner. They would come and overtake me and then just kind of like leave me pulsing in between. And it took me so high. The experience took me so high. And I remember afterwards just getting so emotional. Like I was preparing for pleasure in birth, right? But even I didn't know what was possible. I had no conception of what was possible. And I remember turning to my husband, like heartbroken, like, why didn't I know? Why don't women know that this is possible, right? So you can see I really care deeply about this. Like, this is something that we've really lost and need to reclaim for ourselves.
Totally. When you were talking about this, I was thinking about the whole animal kingdom. There is no other species in the world that goes to some artificial place where to give birth, right? With all these machines and all this stress, they all give birth in the nature, and it's such a natural thing. So where did this natural process got lost on the way? How did we get to implement all these modern ways of giving birth, all this stress and everything that we do to our female bodies during that day?
I think that's such a big question. There's so many layers to that. Um, you know, I know the focus of your podcast is about sex. So I will point out probably like the biggest point of reclamation, which is we don't have an understanding of birth as a part of female sexuality right now. Just even saying the statement birth is a sexual act gets people all like cringy, right? It makes you feel like, oh my God, like that's profane. How could you possibly say that? And I get it. Like I felt that way for years. It was hard for me to say it out loud in talks. And then even after I started saying it, like my body was like, oh, can you really say that, Sheila? But a huge part of it is, we've really separated out all things related to babies and our sexuality, which is ridiculous because how does the baby come to form? How do we conceive our children? It's through our sexuality. It's through our sexual body. And similarly, we birth through our sexual body. So this is one really big piece. The other, quite simply is fear. It's scary. Birth is a really intense experience. And by sharing that, it can be joyful, pleasurable, blissful, I'm not minimizing the intensity of the experience. It's a really big, profound experience, as it should be. Like you are bringing new life into this world. As a woman, you are becoming a mother. It's a rebirth for you as well as, the birth of your baby. It's a really huge rite of passage. And, with it really brings us down to that like primal fear of like, can we control life and death and all of that? And essentially, all the over medicalization of birth it's all really fear driven. And the truth is all the technology that we have, all the procedures that we have, they're wonderful in cases when they're truly necessary. They can be life-saving, life-affirming. But the problem is that we have tried so hard to manage and control a process that really can't be managed and controlled, that actually we're seeing negative results from it. So it's not actually safer to have all of the technology and have all of the interventions, all of that, and there are plenty of studies that show that all of this over medicalization is actually leading to worse outcomes for moms and for babies, not better. So we really, I think, need to rethink our whole approach. But I would say those are the two huge pieces that need to be, we need to like shift and rework our relationship to. It's our relationship to sexuality, not just in birth, just in general, right? In general,
that's a
our
big one.
relationship with our sexuality is a huge one. And, you could feel like shakes of it happening now as women are really starting to rise to reclaim that power and relationship for themselves. But that's a huge one. And then to bring it into our understanding of birth, is another really big piece, to understand that like birth is a sexual act. You are using the same body, the same body parts, the same hormonal systems, to birth your baby as you do when you conceive your baby. And so, the simplest way for a woman to understand this idea that birth can even be pleasurable is, just to think about sex, right? Like sex can be incredibly pleasurable, right? But it can also be incredibly painful. And I think most women can understand that both things are possible in the same act, in the same body. And the difference between the two is what? Like usually it's the conditions under which you're having sex, like how you feel about it, whether your bodies and its processes are being honored and respected. I mean, imagine having sex in fear, right? Like
Yes, that doesn't feel
you
good.
cringing, ouch. And that's how we're birthing. Overwhelmingly, we're birthing in fear. We're
And I,
birthing not turned on. Like imagine having sex if you're not turned on.
oh, I know that. That
Yeah.
doesn't feel very good.
Yeah.
And even if we would try to go into that day feeling turned on, everyone, the society, your mom, it's not her fault. She also learning from someone else. And
Yeah.
everyone around you tells you, oh my gosh, it's going to be so painful. But we're going to be there with you. And you are programmed for 9 months to, feel so much pain and suffering on that day.
Yeah.
So how can we reverse that, or what are the steps to go more into ecstatic birth?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing, and it's not necessarily an easy thing, but the most important thing is to make sure that the people that are going to be supporting you in birth are holding the same vision as you, because it's not, whether it's your midwife or your OB or a doula or your mom or whoever is going to be supporting you in that moment in the birthing room, your partner, like you want them to really be on board and hold that vision for you and be working in that way. And thankfully, there are options. I know depending on where you live, it might be harder to find those options, but I run a program for birth practitioners that's actually global. So I know that this is a global movement. I know that there are, midwives, doulas, childbirth educators, OBs all over the world that really are taking this on and trying to bring this into their practice. So I would say that's really the first thing. The second thing is to really examine your own relationship with your body and your sexuality. How do you feel about your body? How do you feel about your sexuality? Like, are you comfortable? Do you have any past trauma? Unfortunately, studies are showing us that people that have survived sexual trauma or sexual abuse actually do have a harder time giving birth vaginally if they have not consciously cleared that abuse from their body, because our body has memory and it will grip and it will. So really looking at your relationship with your sexuality and, how do you feel pleasure, and under what circumstances do you feel pleasure, and can you bring some of those circumstances into the birthing room, starting to look at it that way. And then I really recommend a process, depending on how much time a woman has, a process of sensual expansion, which is really dedicating yourself to learning how to feel more pleasure, access more pleasure within your own body. So then you can consciously bring that into the birthing room. But, for a woman, that's such a beautiful journey. But for a woman that doesn't have time, who might be, 8 months pregnant or, very close to their due date, you can simply give yourself pleasure in the birthing room if that's something that you feel comfortable with, because the experience of giving yourself pleasure actually stimulates oxytocin flow in your body. And oxytocin is the governing hormone of labor. So when you go to the hospital and they say, oh, your labor is progressing too slowly, we're going to give you Pitocin or we're going to induce you, that's actually a synthetic version of oxytocin. So the experience of feeling pleasure in your body, even if it's like, it could be cuddles, it could be eye gazing, it could be connecting with someone, or it could be orgasm, clitoral stimulation, nipple stimulation, the whole spectrum of pleasure induces oxytocin flow in your body. So that's like a really good shortcut to support yourself in birth. And the fun thing about that is it's going to elevate your experience no matter what, because you're going from having this intense experience with no pleasure to having an intense experience with pleasure. So regardless, by giving yourself pleasure, you're going to be elevating your experience and having a much better time, as well as supporting your body's natural process.
Oh, I love that. I just don't know how would the doctors around me would react if I,
Yeah.
start making out with my partner.
Yeah.
Do you think
Well,
that would be accepted in, I don't know how it's in Germany, but I don't know if
I
they'd
think
be
this
okay with
is
that.
why it's really important to understand like who your practitioners are and are they on board or not. A practitioner that's on board might look at you when you are in the midst of labor and wanting to move things along and say, I'm going to give you some privacy now, right? Walk out the door, walk out the room and close the door and give you some privacy. But a practitioner who's never, who's not on board, who doesn't really understand what we're talking about right now, would get triggered. And the truth is, like, if your practitioner gets triggered, you're going to get triggered, because as a birthing woman, your body is really, really porous and takes in
Mm-hmm.
everybody else. So that's why it's really important to make sure that the people around you are on board. That said, there are things that you can do that are also not necessarily overtly sexual that, for example, like I teach my women a way to sound, to make moan and make sound that really opens up the pelvis and connects you to your sexual energy and feels really good. But, everybody expects a birthing woman to be making sound. So
Mm-hmm.
that, something like that can feel a lot more accessible than, making out with your husband or having sex or, something that's more overtly sexual. So I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I could never do that, this isn't for me, because the truth is there's so much you can do. And it's really about like what is right for you and what is right for your level of comfort, because that's really what it's about. For the birthing woman, it has to feel right for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, ecstatic birth is just about the day or the moment when you give birth, or is like a longer process?
That's a really good question. I like to think it's like that's completely related to how you live your life. It's interwoven, right? But the truth is, nobody's going to come and say, oh, okay, I want to have, I want to have, ecstatic life. So how do I prepare for birth in that way? They're very deeply interrelated. And here's what I find is women, usually what happens is women are scared of giving birth, right? It's this big, scary experience. They've heard about how painful it is. And then they hear about like another possibility. So a lot of times when women come to me, it's like, oh, okay, how can you help me, have less pain, have less fear, and possibly have this amazing birth experience that feels good, that feels joyful, that feels really welcoming of this baby in my family. What I find is that women that prepare, so much of what you do to prepare for an ecstatic birth is actually personal development work, personal growth work. It's a lot of sensual expansion, a lot of like learning to feel pleasure, orient yourself towards pleasure and understand the value of pleasure. So what I find is that women that prepare for birth in this way, it actually carries over beautifully into motherhood. One of the things we really train in is how to connect to your body, how to connect and let the wisdom of your body lead you in birth. And this is a really valuable skill in mothering. It's a really valuable skill in life, to be able to decipher. There are all these messages out there. What's the right one? Well, I need to be able to tune into my body and find the right one for me, the right one for my family. So that's one way. And then the sensual expansion is deeply nourishing, because essentially you're learning how to receive energy from the universe, let it flow through you to feel more pleasure. So that is such a gift to new moms, babies that aren't sleeping, who are exhausted. It's just such a gift in life, because ultimately that's also going to translate into your relationship with your partner, into your sexual experiences. So, it's such a good question you ask, because, most women come in to have help specifically with their birth experience, but I find that it actually spills over into all areas of life. And the fun thing is, I mentioned that I'm working with a lot of birth practitioners so that they can embody this and bring this to their clients. What I find is, a woman who is in devotion to really connecting with her body and her sensuality and her pleasure, there's always a moment of activation, which is like, I understand that I'm here for whatever the purpose is. Like, it's an activation where she goes from feeling like sort of um, unsure about her passion, her purpose, but in coming into this moment, whether it's like in relation to her family, in relation to her clients, or, a different purpose in the world that feels so true and so aligned to her. So that's really fun. And I've been playing with that with women as well, just to use the tools of ecstatic birth in rebirthing themselves and really
Mm.
accessing that inner activation to bring their gifts forward into the world.
Oh, that's so beautiful. So you're not just giving birth to your baby, but you're rebirthing yourself again
Yes.
through this whole process.
Yes.
This a beautiful gift also to yourself.
Yes.
Oh, I love that. um, I had a question and I forgot it. I have another one, which is maybe a little bit personal. You said that your first pregnancy and your first baby, it was a very traumatic birth, but then the second one got better and the third one was very ecstatic. Did you notice any difference, like between you and your baby in the first time or and the third time?
That's a good and very complex question. And I know that there are a lot of people out there and also research to support this idea that like how you birth, it deeply affects your baby and it deeply affects, how they show up in the world and their health and all these factors. I don't really agree with that. And I'll tell you why. Like my own personal, I'm not saying it's not true, or I do think how you birth, it does matter because it's your imprint in life. Like you take in so many messages and understandings about what it is, whether the world is safe or unsafe. There's plenty of research to back that up. But here was my experience with my own child. And I think it's a very like comforting experience for anybody that feels like so much pressure to have the perfect birth or so much guilt because they didn't have the perfect birth is, I had a very traumatic experience giving birth to him. And I feel like when I look at the period afterwards, like there was so much going on that was really hard for me. But I loved that baby so much. And that he was like, all the other stuff around me was like, I don't really care about you. Like, I loved that baby so much. And I doted on that baby. And like, so I feel like at the end of the day, it might sound cliche, but I feel like the power of your love really transcends everything. Like I don't see remnants of trauma or anything like that from his birth experience. I actually think, he's older, so he has a little bit of an advantage now, but I think in some ways he's actually better adjusted than my girls, or I just different. I think every child comes in with their own stuff also, and I do believe to a certain extent that everything is always perfect as is. So if you have an experience that didn't feel perfect by your desire or outer standards, I think there are gifts there for you. And to me, when I look back at that first birth, like I'm so grateful for it, because if it wasn't for that birth, I wouldn't have been propelled into this whole, path where I grew so much as a person, where I blossomed so much as a person. So I think it's so complex. I don't think it's as simple as like, oh, this one had a great birth, so she's great and amazing in the world, and this one had a hard birth, and so she's always having a hard time in the world. I think there's just so much at play.
Mm-hmm. And on a hormonal level, did you notice any difference on how you were feeling the days after?
Postpartum, absolutely. So the first one, I was swollen, like my body was very swollen, and I had a lot of trauma to heal from. Like it was really hard for me to get up out of a chair for months. There was a lot. I was exhausted, sluggish. I looked like I had been beat up. Like it wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. And after the second one, I remember feeling, first of all, I went home because the second one I gave birth in a birthing center. So she was born in the morning. 4 hours later, we were cleared to go home. And I remember, first of all, just being so happy to be home. Whereas the first one, I was like, I can't go home. Like, I still don't, like, my body's still not functional. I'm like, how can I go home? And I just remember just feeling like so vibrant and so healthy and so sensual. I had no swelling. I had energy. It was a completely different experience. You know, when you have drugs put into your system, or when you have incisions that you have to heal from, like that's a really long process. Like your body has to heal. And but when your body mostly goes through the process naturally, like you don't have all of that you have to come back from. So it really is a gift. And, you know, for people that want to kind of like circumvent the birthing process. And I know now there are countries like South Africa and Brazil where C-section rates are almost like 80%, which is crazy. It's like people are just opting to skip the whole birthing process and go straight to C-section. But you're going to be in so much pain after. That's a major surgery to your body. And that on top of having to care for your baby, it's a really rough way to start out in motherhood.
Right.
I think if
Yeah.
you don't have to, I don't, you know.
No, totally. I understand. And I was listening to a podcast the day before, and they were talking about vaginal birth and C-section. And they were saying that if the baby doesn't go through the vaginal canal and taking on the way all this bacteria and the hormones
Yeah.
and whatever, it's not going to have the same immune system that a baby that was born through the vaginal canal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many levels to that, from the blood you receive from your placenta, from the bacteria that you receive from being born, from the squeezing of your body to stimulate your entire system to come awake. Like there's just so many different levels to that in terms of like the health benefits of natural birth, and plenty of research to show that that's the case.
Yes, and I remember when I was younger, so many girls in Romania, they were afraid to give birth through the vaginal canal because everyone was saying, well, after that, you are going to have a very bad sexual life because either you're going to be either very, very tight or very large. So they were very afraid that they are not going to have, or their husband are not going to love them anymore.
Yeah, so that goes right back to this, birth is a sexual act, right? So if you think about, sex when you're turned on and your tissues get engorged, you're actually able to open pretty wide, and that can feel really, really good too. But if you're not engorged, if you're not turned on, the stretching of your tissues can really, really hurt, right? So I think that goes back to like, if you can reclaim birth as a sexual act and understand that like your tissues need to be engorged, they need to be juicy. And to a certain extent, the body will do this naturally, but also to be able to like amplify that for yourself, there's no reason you will not be able to open wide and go right back. It's part of your physiology.
That's the perfect explanation. It just may like click for me right now.
Yeah.
Exactly, like all these tissues engorging and opening and making space for the baby, and then
Yeah, and
closing
it's
again.
so easy to play with that. Like if you don't believe me for yourself, like just start, notice when you're turned on, when you're engorged, how it feels when you stretch out those tissues. It feels really satisfying. It feels really good. Like your body is made for that. But try stretching out your tissues when you're not engorged.
Mm. Let's just talk about the moment when you give birth and
Mm.
you are into that orgasmic state. How does that feel like do you have ever had like another orgasm, not during birthing, like that felt similar to that?
You're asking me if the birth orgasm feels different from a regular orgasm?
Yeah, like could you describe the
Yeah.
orgasmic birth?
So I just want to be completely upfront and say I did not have an orgasm when I was giving birth, not in that way. For me, it was pleasure on all these different realms. So there's so many different ways a woman can experience incredible pleasure during birth, and orgasm is only one of them. So from what I've heard and from what I understand, and from that little bit that I was sharing earlier that I felt, it's it is very similar to an orgasm, but it is much more expansive because the energy flow in your body is so expansive and your body is expanding. I've had women and I've interviewed women, you can find these videos on my YouTube channel or my Facebook page, that talk about it's almost like you're reaching out, like your energy is going out into the universe to retrieve your baby. There's like this connection with all that is. And women, by the way, experience that in birth generally, with or without orgasm. So it's not orgasm specific. But I'm actually interviewing a woman. I don't know when this will go live on your podcast,
Like
but I'm actually 2 weeks. Yes. So by the time this goes live, I have a woman that I'm interviewing next week who talks about, her birth orgasm and how it really brought her to this place of wanting and needing to reclaim her sexuality. Because some women will experience orgasm even without this consciousness of, the event happening that we talk about. And a lot of times when I give talks, women will come up to me and say, oh my God, thank you. I had an orgasm when I was giving birth and I thought I did something wrong. Like I thought, like I was so ashamed. I'm so happy to know that, that's okay. So I think to answer your question about what the orgasm's like, I think there's a really wide spectrum. And I don't think it's, in our culture, we're very like goal oriented and we want to achieve a certain goal. And for me, this work is not really like, if you have an orgasm during birth, that's amazing. And I love that, but it's not really about that. It's not really about like achieving that goal. It's really about you having the best experience that you can have for yourself that's aligned with, how your labor is flowing. And I just want women to walk away from their births feeling like, wow, like my body's amazing. I'm amazing. Like that was incredible, and unfortunately, I think most women walk away from their births feeling really disconnected from their bodies or really disempowered in some way or having to recover from some kind of trauma. So I'm really interested in healing that rift.
do you think that postpartum depression could have something to do with a traumatic birth? I know so many moms that have this problem.
I do. And I don't know that there are any studies that will prove that specifically. However, I do know that there are studies that show a woman that has a C-section has a higher likelihood of having postpartum depression. And part of that is because her body doesn't understand really what happened on a hormonal level, right? Like 1 minute there's a baby there and the next minute there isn't. So it's seen as a loss from a hormonal perspective in the body. And that, that can trigger all kinds of depression issues. So I know that there are studies that talk about that. But I think, let's say you have a vaginal birth and that was pretty traumatic. I would think just having to heal from that in and of itself and having to take care of a newborn, depression is a whole other class of struggle, but that in and of itself is really difficult. Like you don't want to have to start out like that. I mean, taking care of a newborn just alone is a monumental task. And to have to do that while you're healing and feeling like, disconnected from your body in some profound way it's really hard.
I can imagine that. And is the whole concept of ecstatic birth, can that happen at home? Would it be safe to do it at home or just at the hospital?
Yeah, it's really up to you. I don't really like to tell people where they have to birth or with who or even how they have to birth. It's really, ecstatic birth is really about finding alignment with yourself and your inner truth and doing what's right for you, as opposed to like
Mm.
all the messages that tell you you should do this or you should do that. So I think, people that have home births tend to be more likely to have an ecstatic birth, only because you're already in an environment where you feel like comfortable. You can, have the intimacy that you want. You can have the privacy that you want. But women also have these births in birthing centers and in hospitals. And, for some women, being at home is actually not the right choice because they might be too scared to be at home, right? Fear really, really can disconnect you from your ability to open up to pleasure in birth. And so it's not as simple as like there's a right answer. It's like, well, what's the right answer for you?
Mm.
Where do you feel safe? Where do you feel comfortable? Where do you feel like you can surrender and let go?
Yeah, for sure. I think at home it's where you feel the most safe. The only thing is we're kind of afraid, or I would be afraid, because everyone told me in the hospital is the safest. So I'd be afraid if something happens. What if
Yeah.
I die? What if something happens to the baby and then there's no one around and the closest hospital is, I don't know, 20 minutes away?
Yeah. Well, I think there are midwives that attend home births. There are
Mm-hmm.
practitioners that can help. Hopefully, I mean, I know that's not true everywhere, but I think in a lot of places that might be an accessible option. And then I think you want to have a conversation with your practitioner about, well, what happens if there's complications? What do you usually do? What do you want to get really clear on your fears ahead of time. You don't want to have to deal with them in the moment. So even if you're not having somebody attend you in birth, to really, really educate yourself and have a plan. If you do need support, like what's the plan? How are you going to get the help that you need? Okay. Does that feel good to you? Do you feel safe with that? And
Mm-hmm.
if the answer is no, then you find a better option.
Yeah, yeah. So if I would get pregnant now, what would be the best steps to start into this process?
Well, I have a complimentary online course that could just like educate you and give you the full spectrum. So I'm happy to share that link. And if you wanted to share that with your audience, that would be really the first step, is to just kind of be like, am I on board? Like, do I actually want this? What does this mean? So education always is the first step. And then after that, I would say if you're early on in your pregnancy, like sensual expansion, like really explore modalities that help you feel pleasure, expand your pleasure, and really heal any rifts that you have with your sexuality. Now, that said, some of that, especially for women that are high risk, is contraindicated. So you always just want to make sure that what you're doing, it works for your body, and check in with your practitioner. So but yeah, really looking at your sexuality and looking at how you can expand pleasure in your body in relation to birth. And this is a process that I love. I work with women one-on-one on this to really help locate like their point and find ways to expand their pleasure while also preparing their bodies really consciously for birth.
Mm. And because you were saying the whole birth process is somehow also very sexual, and I know there's so many women that have so much shame around their sexuality, and me included, I have also my own problems. So what would you say to those women that have to, those shame problems around giving birth and around sexuality?
I would say take some time and Google ecstatic birth, Google pleasure in birth, Google orgasmic birth, and watch. I mean, like now, 13 years ago, there was nothing when I was preparing, but now there's so many videos, stories, like things that you can watch a woman having an orgasmic birth. There's a documentary created by Deborah Pascali-Bonaro called Orgasmic Birth, and you can watch this really brave woman had her birth videotaped. You can actually see her orgasming as she's birthing her baby. So I would say, like, just first step, like, watch these videos and feel like, does it speak to you? Is it, chances are if you have shame, you might feel contracted, you might feel a little bit triggered. But beyond that, like, do you feel that desire for that? And so if you feel the desire, just claim it and say, like, set that intention for yourself to start to shed these layers of shame. And I think a lot of that you can do by watching other women. It sort of normalizes in your own head what's possible. And then, look for resources to support you in releasing whatever it is that has brought you to this place of shame, whether it's abuse or trauma or cultural conditioning is a really big one too.
Oh yeah, I know. And maybe also introducing your partner to this whole idea and communicating with him, and maybe
Of
also
course.
surrounding yourself with women that maybe have gone through this process, or
Yes.
also pregnant as you. So
Yes, exactly. So you basically, what you have to do is create your own counterculture, because the mainstream culture doesn't really hold this vision, doesn't really support this vision. So as you brilliantly pointed out, like, you create your own counterculture by immersing yourself in messages that really support the vision of what you want. And bringing your partner on board is imperative. Like, you have to have your partner on board, because they're going to be right there with you in the birthing room. So you want to be in this together. So I will say one thing, like, men tend to be a lot more like, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? I know, because my husband was one of those men. So they tend to get wooed more by like statistics and facts. And so, sharing that sort of thing with them about like safety, their concern tends to be safety. They want to keep you safe. They love you. So really sharing statistics about, how to create that safety, and how this more sort of modality creates more safety, tends to help the men get on board.
yes, for sure, for sure. And you were saying you are working just with other practitioners, or you're working also one-on-one with other women that want to
Yeah,
do
I
ecstatic
work
birth?
I work with a small group of private clients who want to have an ecstatic birth. So I do a few different things. Like I said, I have the free consciousness raising email program that's available to everybody. Next level would be, I have a digital program for mamas to be who just kind of want to learn a little bit more, get some practices, but aren't necessarily like all in. They're still doing their thing, but they also want to learn more about ecstatic birth and get some of the body practices to help them expand in their sensuality and have more pleasure in birth. And then I also work one-on-one with some women to help them prepare for their births. And then I also do a year-long training for birth practitioners, anyone that supports a woman at any point through her fertility cycle, through motherhood, to help them integrate all of this into their offerings for their clients.
I like that. It's all
Yeah.
online, or is everything it's in the States?
Everything's online. This
Perfect.
is a wholly global movement. Everything is online. From the moment I started my work 10 years ago, this has been a global, 5 continents. It's really fun. That's the coolest thing about this is, maybe not the coolest thing that women are suffering all over birth, but it's the coolest thing that there is this intention to elevate birth all around the globe. And, I've seen that everywhere. So I work primarily online. I do some workshops, in-person workshops, but at this point they're few and far between. It takes
Mm.
like a radical person to say like, I want this workshop. I'm going to organize the women, and Sheila, will you come? At which point I'll say, maybe, yeah, but I don't really, I don't tend to organize those myself.
I like that. Thank you so much for all your wisdom and for everything that I learned from you today. Now I feel more like at ease and more motivated to know it can be also pleasurable. It doesn't have to be pain and suffering.
Mm. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. And thank you so much for having me and really having the courage to have this conversation. It's a big one. And I'm so happy to be a part of raising the awareness, and to have your support in that is everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Just one last thing. If people want to find you and want to do your online courses, where they can find you?
My website is ecstatic-birth.com, and I'm on most social media under the handle Ecstatic Birth.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the show notes also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Oh, lots of love.